Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 259 of the JavaScript Jabber Show. This week on our panel we have Joe Eames.
Hey everybody.
Aimee Knight.
Hello.
Cory House.
Hi everybody.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. I'm going to do a quick shout out about Newbie Remote Conf. If you're new or want to speak to the problems that new people have, a call for proposals is open. So go check that out. It's going to be online. We have a special guest this week, and that is Ryan McDermott.
Hi, how's it going?
Do you want to give us a brief introduction? Who you are, why you're awesome?
Don't know about the latter, but yes, I'm my name's Ryan. I work as an engineer at Google, and I have been a professional developer for 5 years now, if I may call myself professional. I do mostly front-end stuff, and I've done full stack before, and everything in between.
So I'm curious, do you write clean code over at Google?
I try to write clean code. It's kind of a values thing, right? It's like the golden rule. You try to treat everyone the way you want to be treated, but occasionally you fall short, and I've been a hypocrite many times on clean code. I've probably written functions that have 8 parameters and that are 1,000 lines long, and I've done everything bad before.
Yeah, we actually brought you on to talk about your project, the Clean Code JavaScript repo that you have out there, which is, I don't know if I would call it a style guide, but it's definitely a clear, hey, this is how you write clean, good, easy to read, easy to maintain JavaScript. Do you want to kind of explain what it is and where you got this from?
Yeah. So
this episode is sponsored by Hired.com. Are you searching for a new job? That can be stressful, scary, and time-consuming. Pushy recruiters try to sell you on roles you don't actually want, and the job boards make you feel like you're throwing your resume into a black hole, never to be seen again. And sometimes you go all the way through the interview process just to find out at the very end that the salary, offer, or company culture doesn't match what you're looking for. Hired is the world's most intelligent talent matching platform for full-time and contract opportunities in engineering, development, design, product management, data science, sales, and marketing. We make your job search faster, focused, and stress-free. Instead of endlessly applying to companies and hoping for the best, Hired puts you in control of when and how you connect with compelling new opportunities. After completing one simple application, top employers apply to hire you, and on Hired you receive personal interview requests and upfront salary information so you can make informed decisions about what opportunities to pursue over a condensed timeline. Hired offers access to more than 4,000 innovative employers, including big brand names like Facebook and smaller emerging startups. The size and type of company you want to connect with is totally up to you. And we help you find new opportunities in 17 major cities in North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Open to relocation? Let them know. Your privacy and autonomy in your job search is of utmost importance. And if you go check them out at the show's link, that's hire.com/JavaScript Jabber, you can get double the hiring bonus that they offer. That's $600 instead of $300. So go check them out at hire.com/JavaScript Jabber today. You want to kind of explain what it is and where you got this from?
Yeah. So I guess I can wind the clock back about 5 years ago. So I started programming professionally, and I was taking on contracts and doing stuff like that. And I was doing a fair amount of JavaScript at the time, but that was mostly kind of stuff with here's a button click and here's an event, and just try to get it back into your Django template and then send it off to the server. So this is kind of, around the time, I guess, front-end frameworks were picking up a little bit, but JavaScript, as many might remember, was sort of the backwater language and was really just glue. And then, kind of came into its own to be a real client-side, language. And so I started seeing all that happen and got really into that. And I sort of moved away from Django and Rails stuff and started doing more stuff with the Backbone and Ember and then later React. And, the whole time I was doing it, I was writing plenty of stuff in JavaScript that when I'd go back and read it and go, oh my goodness, what is this? What am I doing? And I remember about a year or two into my career, someone said, you got to read this book. It's called Clean Code. And they're like, it's in Java. And I was like, oh goodness, that's ancient. And I don't know if I can even read that. And so I started reading it and, picked up some of the concepts and I thought, oh, it's pretty interesting. I've seen some of this in my own code. And concurrently at that time, someone mentioned, you should keep a code diary and write down the stuff that bothers you about what you do or bothers you about what you see in a code base or in the world in general with code. And so I started doing that. And, about, I'd say 6 or 7 months ago, I was looking back at my code diaries and I was rereading Clean Code, my yearly pilgrimage towards it. And I thought, hey, there's not really much written about this in JavaScript. And there's a lot of problems in JavaScript that really are very much applicable to the idea of clean code concepts, even though it's not Java, it's JavaScript. So I thought, well, no one's talking about this. Let me just write it down. And, I produced something that's kind of like a style guide. It's, sort of a living, breathing README document that goes through code smells, bad code, good code, and sort of just adapts clean code concepts and other things that I've sort of come to, pick up in my own sort of ideas and put my own take on it. And yeah, people have really kind of flocked to it and have contributed a lot. And it's been a pretty rewarding project.
I absolutely love it. I know when I first saw this, I put it in our Slack channel at work, and we do a lunch and learn usually every week. And so we took like a couple weeks and just went through it as a team together. So it was really, really good for like getting everybody on the same page. That's
great. That's wonderful.
Well,
That's
awesome. One thing that I've seen is that, I've heard Uncle Bob speak about solid principles, and I've heard several other people speak about solid principles. And so it's kind of interesting just from the standpoint of they talk about these high-level ideas, like single responsibility or open-close principle, and you kind of get an idea of what it's about, but then to actually see somebody say, okay, you don't necessarily call out, because of single responsibility principle, we're doing this instead of that. But, it is, hey, we're going to do encapsulation this way, or we're going to do, conditionals this way. And you can kind of feel the flavor of it in very specific examples, as opposed to being in a position where it's, oh, okay, I'm just going to do solid because, single responsibility principle, or, the Liskov substitutability principle. I can't even remember them all. But, it's those kinds of things. And at the high level, it's like, okay, I get it. But then when you look at the actual code, then it's, okay, so how does this apply to this? Am I making these mistakes? And your examples are very concrete. Oh, if your code looks like this, you're making this mistake. And if your code, looks like this, then you're handling these cases well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I really kind of try to put it in the best sort of example form I could. And, JavaScript's great because you don't have as much visual noise because you don't have types. So you can kind of just see the actual business logic there. And I learn very much through example. I tend to stray away from the theoretical. And I think a lot of people in the JavaScript community and dev community at large are probably along that line too, that they want to see, here, look, show me some actual code. And you mentioned Liskov substitution principle, and that one, when you read the paper on it and the theory behind it, it's a little obtuse and it's very formal language. But then when you actually see it laid down, you go, oh my goodness, I've done that before. And that if you just see it written down as an example, it immediately clicks.
Yeah, well, and you shared in the notes that you sent us the talk by Uncle Bob, and so he was talking about the Liskov substitutability principle, and yeah, he immediately goes to squares and rectangles, and the fact that the structure of the code doesn't look the same, and I always just assumed his example that the squares and rectangles would be substitutable because squares are rectangles, but in the representation, they don't parallelize and you can't make certain assumptions about it. And he explains it, and we'll put a link to the talk in the show notes. But yeah, I was like, oh, okay, I really do get it. It's not, you have these two things that are related because one is a subset of the other. It's, I can make the same assumptions about one set of code as the other set of code, and that's why I can substitute them, even though in the real world, the things that they represent are substitutable. In implementation and code, they may not be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. So yeah, if you take it kind of to the sort of, I guess, philosophical level, it's really LSP, Liskov substitution principle, is really kind of sort of a baked down pragmatic version of what polymorphism is supposed to be. And you're supposed to be able to use, your objects that maybe they derive from, some base class. And if this is JavaScript, they can just extend some prototype, but they should be able to kind of be used the same way. And you shouldn't have to kind of go, uh-oh, what is this? And, get a runtime error and go, oh, that's right. Yeah, I can't do this method on a square. I can't call get area the same way because you calculate area on a square differently than you do on a rectangle, that kind of thing.
Yep.
Yeah. So that principle is pretty good. And the solid principles sort of are the backbone of clean code. But yeah, I think the book in the larger set of principles are really awesome because that, they cover everything from how do you name your variables all the way to how do you handle concurrency, and that breadth is pretty much covers most of what you're going to see as a developer. And JavaScript being so ubiquitous, it has all the same problems that you'd find in any language. So you have to think about how you can name your variables and how long your functions are and how you do your classes. So solid principles apply there too. So, yeah.
I have more questions, but I want to give everyone else a chance.
The material that produced, it's all centered around this one GitHub repo. Is that right?
The material that I'm covering, you mean? Or
yeah.
Yes. So and I guess y'all can link in the show notes. But yeah, so basically the project that I did was called Clean Code JavaScript, and yeah, so it's basically just adapting the Clean Code book and then some other concepts as well. And, putting it all into the lingua franca of JavaScript.
Mm-hmm. So is everything that you've produced in this GitHub repo, or are you producing any other materials?
I pretty much try to keep everything here. There's sort of a larger talk that I've been working on, and I guess really a project that kind of covers some of the ideas around what actually is a good architecture and how does clean code inform that. So I've kind of chose to name it the 3 R's of architecture, which is readability, reusability, and refactorability. And I kind of mentioned that phrase a few times in this project.
I was just about to ask that because I hadn't, I know those are all good things, but I hadn't really heard of calling it software architecture pyramid.
Yeah. That's kind of, so basically the idea that I kind of had been thinking of for a while is, how do you think hierarchically about your code? And, clean code helps you pretty much at every level. But when you think about how you're going to go develop an application, like if you're going to do a shopping cart, you can apply it to anything. But like if you take a shopping cart example, you have at the very bottom of sort of this pyramid of ideas, you have readability. So, is your code formatted well? Do you have good variable names? Your function's short? Can you just read the code? Does it look good? And you go, okay, I know what this is doing. And then, you start stepping up the pyramid and you think about reusability. So that's to say, if I have a shopping cart application, I may have, something that does a currency conversion. And, I don't want to bake that business logic into the inventory, class. I want that to be its own independent thing, because if you have a currency converter, it doesn't have much to do with your inventory or your shopping cart or your user pane or any of that kind of thing. It's its own entity. And so you can test it by pulling it out. You can control it. And, that's one thing I've seen in the JavaScript world. And I did it a million times where, when I would do the jQuery kind of, spaghetti code in the beginning, where you'd be handling an event that comes from, the DOM, and then you may do some sort of interesting logic on it. I was putting all those functions inside of the actual DOM manipulation code and the event handling code. So you do like a color picker, and then all the sort of interesting stuff around hue, saturation, and value calculation was all baked in right there into the DOM stuff. And that's not very reusable, because, you could take your color picker thing and move it over to React or Ember or something else. So reusability is a very well-known concept in software, but it's a very important thing. And I think it's kind of hierarchically builds on top of readability, because if you don't have readability, you don't have reusability as easily, because people don't know what's going on in your code if they can't see how it's named and such. And then I sort of, the last thing I mentioned is refactorability. And, that's sort of the idea that you should be able to modify modules and, do changes to them and not have it break something all the way over, and maybe even some other organization. Because I think we've all done stuff where we'll be working on, let's say, a shopping cart application, and we change the way that the button handler works, or we change the way that the currency is shown, and then somehow it breaks something in the user panel, and you're like, how did that happen? Like, those two things aren't related. So refactorability is about minimizing side effects. It's about being very testable. Testability really, really informs refactorability, because if you have your tests, you can do what I call the Friday night test, where if you can go home on a Friday night after pushing your code and feel really good on the weekend, then you have pretty good refactorable, testable code. And that's sort of the way I like to think of it. It's not the sort of pyramid, the 3 R's of architecture don't necessarily give you an architecture, but they're a way of guiding your thinking when you come up with something.
I guess, even to add to this, one thing that I really like about it, I feel like this is excellent it's good for people of all levels, but especially for newer developers, because as somebody who hasn't been doing this for a long time, I get like a lot of emails and stuff with people saying, should I start with React? Should I start with Angular 4? Should I, just do vanilla JavaScript? And, there's a lot of material out there to guide you on how to write, idiomatic code for whatever framework you're using. But my recommendation is always to start with just vanilla JavaScript. And so there's really not anything like this out there to learn, good principles like that for just vanilla JavaScript.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I feel the same way. I think, the JavaScript community has such amazing tools, and it's probably has, in my opinion, one of the best ecosystems out there. And there's a lot of other great languages and such, but JavaScript has such good tooling, and it's easy to get carried away with the tooling and think only in terms of the tools. But then, you always have to remember, you're a programmer, you're a developer, you're an engineer, you're making things that really are irrespective of languages, because if you think about it really long and hard, you start to realize, React or Ember or your database or Express or any piece of your stack is just an implementation detail. Your actual business logic and what makes your code awesome and unique and helps the world is irrespective of any kind of framework, because the JavaScript community is going to change like it always does. But you want your code to be breathable and livable, and it be able to react, no pun intended, to the changing world. And you want it to be able to, you can take your currency converter and move it into somewhere else. And I think that kind of discipline and principle is, it's definitely, you're always learning, and I certainly am, and you're always going to make mistakes, and don't ever beat yourself up for it. But it's important to think about those principles, because, like I said, the world's just going to change on you.
So that actually leads me to a discussion that we were having after Ruby Rogues this morning. So I record 3 podcasts on Tuesdays, and we were talking afterward about RSpec versus Minitest, which are 2 testing frameworks for Ruby and Rails. And the conversation basically came up that a couple of people really didn't like RSpec anymore, because every time they upgraded Rails or upgraded RSpec, they'd have to refactor their tests. And so even though our spec is more readable, the maintenance issues whenever you had to do an upgrade were a problem. And where if you stick with the default mini test, it just kind of works. And I'm curious, what's your take on that? Because you said, yeah, the world's going to change on you. So what if the way that the world changes creates fewer maintenance headaches in one area, but that one area means less readable code or tests?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, when you break it down, architecture is sometimes and often called the things that are hard to change about your code. And there are going to be things that are hard to change. Like it is hard to change an implementation language. So if you have, you're working on, let's say, an airline software booking system, and you write it in node.js, and then you have, obviously JavaScript on the front end, it's going to be pretty hard to change that node.js backend or your front end to Elm. But architecture informs what's hard to do. But your tooling, you should try to make it as implementation detail less as you can. Mm-hmm. So whether you choose to use MongoDB or a classical relational database like MySQL, your database should be an implementation detail. Your web server, if you're using Express or whatever, should be an implementation detail. And even your tests if you can. But there are going to be things that are hard to change. Like, if you are using an assertion library, and that assertion library only does, assert statements this way, and then there's another one that does it another way. It can be hard to change because, JavaScript doesn't have abstract classes or interfaces like other languages do. So people that are writing these libraries can't basically, compile it to a specific type of interface, and then everyone kind of shares that. So people will do their own APIs. So it's going to be hard to change things sometimes. And I think, the feelings that people have around upgrading are valid, and it's tough, but try the best you can to keep the implementation details out, because yes, you are going to change something sometime.
One other thing I noticed on here is that your examples are not in classical ES5. I mean, you have like class, Boeing 777 extends airplane, which is not ES5. It's not real JavaScript, as all of our friends named AJ would say. So, was there a reason that you picked these building examples in these ways as opposed to doing it in a more classical or global way? Something that works in every browser.
Yeah, it's a good question. So when I published this, I was just working on my own, and I published this to Reddit and a few other sites, and I said, what do you guys think? Can I have some feedback? And then it started getting shared around a lot. And then I woke up in the morning, and then I had maybe 20 emails of issues and pull requests and things. And originally I had written it very ES5-like. And in fact, I didn't even use ESLint on it, which I should have, because I was just writing this down in a markdown document for, a long time. But yeah, I think kind of the community, there's like 60 plus contributors on this, really good feedback and help from people. And it kind of got steered towards the ES6 world, which, for better or for worse is, I guess an okay representation of where JavaScript is. But yeah, you're right. ES5 is certainly going to be much more compatible across the entire ecosystem of browsers and runtimes.
Now, you mentioned something I was curious about, and that is contributors.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I got, let's see, I think I posted this in November, and a few days after I posted, I started getting a lot of contributions and a lot of, people with a ton of expertise, whether it was from, Golang or C++, or they were very tried and true Java developers, or just people just starting out and were confused by things that were in there. And so I got a huge breadth of contribution and insight. And it was really great because, like the old saying goes, it's like, you only have X number of years experience, but with 10 or 100 people, you have thousands of years of experience. And there's no way you're going to ever have 1,000 years of experience. And that's why working with people and getting your stuff out there and getting feedback is really, really important, because you're not gonna think of everything.
And I also imagine that you got a fair amount of, I mean, this is the type of topic that would generate a lot of very opinion-based feedback as well, right?
Yeah, it's very true. Yeah, I mean, in Clean Code, I think in the preface of the book, it basically says you may violently disagree with certain things, and I didn't have anything that was, commentary that was super negative. But yeah, there's a lot of opinions, and I got strong opinions on sections that I think are perennially very controversial. And there's a lot of fruitful debate. There was times where it kind of broke down amongst contributors to being a little too negative and a little too critical. But for the most part, yeah, there was a lot of talk around stuff that was very, very fundamentally controversial and hard. So stuff like don't repeat yourself, no duplicate code. That's always going to be a controversial thing because, the idea of DRY, don't repeat yourself, is that simply as it says, don't be duplicating code over the place. Because if you have a method that, let's say, back to our currency conversion, does currency conversion in this one module and then it does it in another, then you have to update both, right? Because let's say a currency conversion changes, right? And you've baked it in from US dollars to rupees, and then now you have to change it in both places. So pulling it out into its own thing makes it so you only have to, do it in one place. But I got a lot of feedback, which was really good around that, because I'm pretty staunch on that. Anytime I see a chance to pull it out, I do. But there's a lot of feedback, and it's very good feedback, which is that you got to be very careful when you start to separate your code out, because if you make the wrong API and you've modularized a piece of code, well, everything's going to start depending on that API. And if you haven't thought it through well, now you have the same problem as if you change your API, you have to change tons of different places in your code base.
Yeah, one other thing just to pile onto dry is that I've used static analysis tools that will point out code that is structurally similar and say that those need to be dried up. They need to, they repeat themselves, but because they handle two completely different contexts and completely different things, even though they structurally look similar, I want to keep them separate so that if I have to update one algorithm, I don't have to, pull the other one out or do any major refactoring to make it work for both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, if you have like a list example where you have a user list and then you have something like a customer list, and they both do very similar things on parsing the data and displaying it, but users and customers are going to have very different types of data and potentially very different kinds of algorithms to process that. It could be very structurally similar, but if you over genericize it, then you can start running into cases where, and I mentioned this in the Clean Code JavaScript project, that where you start putting lots and lots of conditionals. And when you start seeing lots and lots of conditionals, especially in a generic function, you're probably doing something wrong. There's a code smell there, and it probably needs to be refactored.
Mm-hmm. One other thing that you talked about in how this came about that I honestly had never heard of before, I've been programming professionally for 10 years or so now, was the code diary. I mean, you said, it's just stuff that you like or don't like, or, can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I'm curious what it is and what people can learn from doing something like that, especially new people.
Yeah. So,
Are you looking to expand your skills in mobile development? Have an idea for the next Angry Birds app? Then you need to check out iOS Remote Conf, produced by the same team that brings you your favorite devchat.tv podcasts like Ruby Rogues and iFreaks. Join us for 2 days of jam-packed fun and learning streamed to you live May 17th and 18th. Go check it out at iosremoteconf.com.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because I'm curious what it is and what people can learn from doing something like that, especially new people.
Yeah. So, when I was starting out, I had a friend that advised me, and he said, one of the things that I wish I had done was write down my thoughts and feelings about what I'm learning, what I've seen. And I thought, it's pretty interesting, because when you're in, life in general, it's good to reflect, write a blog, or, write what your current thoughts are on social media and this and that. And I thought, yeah, it's a pretty useful thing. And so I kind of structure it basically with three aspects, and going in that order, I think of what did I learn today, so sort of a TIL. What did I like about code that I saw today? What did I think, oh goodness, this is cutting out hundreds of lines, and this is really, really awesome and helps me make my code more readable or whatever. And then what's stuff that you don't like? It can be your own code, or it could be something else you saw in the code base. And you don't have to write down every little bit of code and copy stuff out of your code base, but generally, what principles and things have you seen that kind of maybe bother you, maybe are really appealing? And I've tried to do this as regularly as I can, but like any kind of thoughtful reflection, you're not going to do it every single day. But I had a bunch of stuff that I had written down and thought of, and I go, oh, this really is, a lot of it is just about clean code, and some of it is about ecosystem things happening in the world. But I thought, let me see what I can do with this and adapt it.
So what are you hoping that people will learn from something like Clean Code JavaScript? I mean, is there some overarching lesson, or is it just do this, not that?
Yeah, I think so. That's a good question. There's a few key takeaways, and they kind of come up in all the concepts. And if you just take these concepts away and that's all you remember, I think it's pretty useful. So, the first thing is basically write code that shows its intent, and so that includes stuff like really good variable names, really good function names, well-named files, files that aren't 8,000 lines long. We've all done that, where you'll have, your entire program in one file. Split it up, make it understandable, make it so where when you read someone's code, read your code, that it reads basically like, okay, yeah, I know what this does. And there's going to be pieces that are business logic intense, or algorithms that, may need some sort of explanation. But try to write code that reads very, very clearly, like almost like a news article. And so, a secondary point to that is, write code that does one thing. So if it's a function, make sure it does one thing. If it's a class, single responsibility principle, make it do one thing. Because when you have code that does one thing, it's much easier to grok what's happening. You don't think, oh, well, I have, in this airplane booking reservation system, I have this one class that handles the bookings, but then what it also does is it does database validation on a customer request to make sure that, oh, okay, what if they take a flight on this day, but then there's, airport problems sometimes here and weather and this. And if you have functions that are doing this, where they're basically doing everything you can imagine that's maybe related or maybe not, pull those things out, do just one thing. And then, I think kind of a final point on clean code is be consistent. And consistency matters a lot, because you are going to be one person on hopefully a team that where you are one single contributor, and people are going to be looking at your stuff, and you are going to also be looking at their stuff, and you're going to read, tons and tons more code than you will ever write. And that's something I think that stuck with a lot of people, which is you are going to be reading code much more than you're going to be writing code. So be consistent with how you name things, be consistent with the kinds of domain specific names you give your variables and your functions, and be consistent about the formatting. Formatting is a big thing. And, if your code is all sorts of scattered around and you have braces on one line, and then, you put them next to the actual, whatever's invoking that, and you don't have any consistency around that, that can be a lot of visual noise that distracts from just reading the code. So I think those three things, if you don't take away anything specific, if you just take those away, those inform a lot of what you will do, regardless of if it's a JavaScript or not. And, I think that's kind of what I would want people to take away, because that's something I wish I had just learned, on day one.
So I feel like this is like the inevitable question. Do you have any tips on conveying the importance of spending a little bit of time on this kind of stuff to product?
Yeah. So I've written plenty of code that when I look back, I go, oh goodness, that's not my favorite favorite code that I've ever written. But yeah, I think, when you write code, and when I've written code, it's been, what's more important seems to be, and it's always going to be, how, meeting your deadlines, getting the requirements done. And then secondarily, it's making sure that it's, readable, reusable, refactorable, because when you're developing a product, everyone else you're working with, whether it's designers or product managers or any kind of business person or customer success, whatever it is, everyone cares about, what does the program help you do, help the world do? And it may not even be on people's minds, and it probably isn't, that, well, how easy is it to modify this code? How easy is it to add a new feature? Because as you get more and more code in your code base and on your product, you are going to find inevitably that it can get much harder to add new features. When you start out on a product and you start out on a code base, you think it should always get easier, and it should. That should be our guiding light, our North Star, that it should always get easier, because when you start developing a product, you start adding interesting libraries that are very reusable, that can handle, this new thing that we may encounter later on. And it should get easier, but oftentimes you find it just gets harder and harder.
Yep.
And, so when you're developing a product, think about how it can be reusable. Think about how well this reads to other people, because if you slow anyone down, and inevitably you can be slowed down by your own code. If you slow anyone down, it can make adding something new and helping your users out, it can make that tougher. And that's, you definitely don't want that.
So I was curious, obviously, thanks. So I was curious, Uncle Bob's book used Java, and Java is strongly typed. JavaScript is dynamically typed. Were there any points that you found that you feel like the rules for clean code differ on JavaScript because it is a dynamic language? Or another way to put this question, do you feel like the rules for clean code differ for dynamic languages versus statically typed languages?
Yeah, I think they do. I think it's more when you get down into stuff around organizing modules. So JavaScript, for example, doesn't have interfaces or abstract classes. Something like Java will have things that are called interfaces. So you can have one class or multiple classes that implement the same interface. They can be used the same way. And this is how you can achieve things like dependency inversion, where you basically have two separate modules. They may do separate things, but they both implement the same interface. So I think one of the things I mentioned in here was you can have a request module, and that request module could do some fancy new WebSocket thing, or it could do some sort of I/O that we've never seen before, like communicate through space. But they all implement .request, and your HTTP requester is going to do the same thing. Well, in JavaScript, you don't have an interface, so you don't have something that's statically typed and says, okay, when I compile this piece of code, it's going to make sure it does everything that this interface is supposed to do. And so the onus is on us as developers doing JavaScript to say, okay, this has to implement this. And that can be a hard thing to sort of come to terms with, because JavaScript allows you to iterate very, very quickly. When you don't have static types, and you don't have interfaces and that kind of thing, you can just go. And that is a very powerful tool, but it can be deadly, because you may not think about, well, what is my fancy WebSocket I/O requester supposed to do? Am I supposed to name my functions like this, or am I supposed to name it like that? So interfaces and static types give you a lot of robustness, and back to the sort of 3 R's, they give you a lot of refactorability, because you can be pretty sure, not always 100%, but you can be pretty sure that if you make a change or you implement a new class that uses this kind of interface, that you're not going to have some crazy breaking change.
Well said. Yeah, I agree. That's a good summary.
Yeah, good.
Is there a way for people to know if their code is improving? Let's say they go in and they say, you know what, I'm going to do, I'm going to make sure I'm doing the top 5 things on here. And then, you know, how do they measure that? Do they just keep tally marks of how many WTFs they run into, or?
So that was what you're referring to was, if you haven't seen the project, it's basically there's a picture that sort of leads into the book, Clean Code, that is basically how do you measure in a quantifiable way what clean code looks like, what good architecture looks like. And they say it's the number of, WTFs that you see when you're reading through someone's code or your own code. And yeah, that's a very hard thing, right? Because, we're used to, in the ideas of computer science, of being very, very explicit and exact about things. So when you do an algorithm, you learn things about time complexity and space complexity, and you can measure things in O of N notation and such. But in architecture and programming and software in general, you almost don't ever do that. You get maybe down into the weeds and you're thinking about, how long this program is going to take to run X or Y. But really, it's sort of the art of computer science. That's what clean code and architecture is all about. So it's going to be hard to say. And in fact, you may think that other people's code isn't, like yours, or yours isn't like, there isn't. It's, that human aspect of it is always going to be there. And that's why it's important to, set team rules and talk to each other, communicate a lot, because it's going to be hard to say what's clean and what's not. But I think, there's sort of basic heuristics you can do. Like I was mentioning the Friday night test, where if you could push your code on a Friday night and feel really good about it and sleep well on the weekend, your code is probably pretty robust. If you can make a change and that, okay, it's not going to affect something that, Sally or Bob or whoever is working on, that, okay, this code is probably pretty clean, but it's hard to get an objective quantifiable measure on it.
If anybody wants to have their code critiqued, I'm sure that it's easy to find people that will tell you how much you suck at whatever it is that you do. That's coding or anything, really. Yeah. I mean, humans are good at that.
Yeah, that's the old saying, right? If you want to know something on the internet, don't ask a question, just post the wrong answer.
So true.
People will always want to correct you.
A friend of mine,
I've heard that, but that's awesome.
A friend of mine once was talking about building an app that would do code reviews for people. And basically, the whole idea was you would submit your code, no matter what you submit, it would say this sucks, and then it would make up a bunch of reasons.
Yeah. If you want free code reviews, just post your code and say this is the best code that's ever been written.
Yeah.
That's free code reviews right there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that would be an interesting service, right? You could just make a Slackbot thing for it and post it. That's an interesting business model. Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see where the future takes us, because I think I mentioned in the project, it's we're only like 50 years into software. I mean, it when you look at the amount of human creation in other areas, like actual architecture, which goes back thousands and thousands of years, there's more codified practices, and there's more understanding around things of what not to do and what to do. And we're only like 50 years in, and we're still figuring out stuff all the time. I mean, there's stuff when I started out in JavaScript that I thought, oh, this is totally the way we're always going to do this. And then something like React came along and I was like, oh my God, Flux? And then I can't imagine my life without it. And there's going to always be stuff like that. And so it'll be interesting to see where it goes. Maybe there is something in the future that's machine learning based, and it's aggregated, millions and millions of lines of code, and then somehow can say, oh, you know what? This doesn't reveal intent. Oh, this isn't reusable. Your API is too big, or this code sucks, It'll be interesting to see where it goes, but I bet maybe we'll have something objective in 50 years.
Right. The other thing related to that, that came up in the talk that you posted to our notes that Uncle Bob gave, was at the very beginning. He was asking, how many of you have been programming for 1 year, 5 years, 10 years? And then he basically pointed out that the number of programmers in the world basically doubles every 5 years. So we're essentially always an industry full of amateurs. And I thought that was very interesting too. So how do we perpetuate this kind of learning down to, the the person, the two people who are going to come in and replace me over the next 10 or 15 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a really good point that he made, and it's something I really agree with. And yeah, I think it's sort of a values thing, right? Because in other areas, other industries, I mean, I haven't worked in actual architecture, but I assume that when you're building a real physical building, there are things and practices that are basically best practices, and they're culturally ingrained in what you do and what it means to be a professional. And there's still a lot of, this is my idea, this is how I do it, this is how we've done it, that kind of attitude in software, because it's still so young. And I think that we do prescribe a lot of things in software, and we prescribe some good things, but we don't always prescribe great, I guess, engineering thinking, or it's sort of an afterthought. So we talk a lot about in computer science that you need, like I was saying, to think about time complexity, space complexity. You need to think about how algorithms and data structures work at the fundamental level. And then that will kind of guide what you do when you make a program or make an engineering decision. And it does. It's not that it's unimportant, but I think we don't also, pair with that the idea that, hey, when you're actually engineering something, there's a lot more at a sort of meta level that you need to be thinking about. And I think that's sort of a cultural thing that just has to come along. And I think, it is. And I think that the world of software has gotten so much better. I remember when I was young trying to program stuff, and I was doing, Visual Basic and all sorts of, stuff in C and Perl. And I remember how much it's changed since then. It was very hard to reuse code. I mean, code was hardly even, versioned that I saw, and there wasn't an easy way to exchange code. And heck, I didn't even use version control. A lot of us didn't, right? So there's things that we've learned, and I think we'll continue to learn. But yes, to foster anyone new coming in, I think that, yeah, you got to think about sort of the art behind the computer science. That's a good value to have.
All right. Well,
are you trying to figure out how to stay current with Ruby and Rails? I'm putting on a 2-day online conference called Ruby Remote Conf. You can check it out at rubyremoteconf.com. Like I said, it's a 2-day conference where you can come and listen to speakers and experts from all around the world talk to you about issues pertaining to Ruby and web development. We have an online Slack channel, a roundtable discussion on Zoom, and all of the talks are given over Google Hangouts, and all of the talks will be streamed to you live. Come check us out at rubyremoteconf.com.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks. Aimee, do you want to start us off with picks?
Sure, I can go. So the first thing I was going to pick, I just got my flights all situated for RevConf. It's June 1st and 2nd, so that was going to be my first pick. And then another pick, my food one for this week, this brand of chocolate. I don't think I've picked this before. It's called Lily Sweets, but they have dark chocolate that is sweetened with stevia. So it's like, if I want some dark chocolate, that's what I try to go for. It's a little bit healthier since I try not to eat a lot of sugar. And then my other one is a blog post I saw, how to write a good Vim RC. And as somebody newer who has played around with Vim, like a lot of times I'll go look at different examples and I don't necessarily understand some of the lines in there. So the opening line of this says, don't put any lines in your Vim RC that you don't understand. So he just breaks down his Vim RC and what everything in there means. So if you're looking to get started with that, I thought this was an excellent blog post. So I'll put a link for all that stuff in the show notes, and that's it for me.
My brain already hurts just thinking about an article like that. Like I've looked in my Vim RC, and holy cow.
It's good though for breaking it down.
Nice. Joe, what are your picks?
All right. So I think it should be obvious that somebody should be picking the Clean Code book. And there's some related books that are definitely, if you're into this topic at all, which you should be, The Clean Coder by the same author, The Pragmatic Programmer, and Code Complete, all fantastic books. in this category. So I definitely want to pick all of those. Lastly, I went and saw Kong this last weekend, and although I doubt we'll see it up for Best Picture, I think it was pretty fun to watch. So those are my picks.
All right, Cory, what are your picks?
So my first pick is a book called In the Plex, which is all about Google and how it got started. Very fascinating read, learning about how PageRank came to be and all the stories that happened behind the scenes. I've also been thinking this week about focus and a quote that has been in my head, which is from the book Paradox of Choice, which says, "Choice has made us not freer, but more paralyzed, not happier, but more dissatisfied." I put out a blog post this week about working on a single monitor, which is a very controversial idea, but I've found that working on one monitor is helping me be more focused. So an interesting idea, but this idea of removing choices from our lives can be a way to actually focus more on a single task and get things done. So those are my two.
All right, I'll jump in with a couple of picks. The first thing that I want to quickly pick is a while back we had a JavaScript Jabber forum that never really took off. I think there were several reasons for that, but one of the main reasons was that I have a really bad habit of not logging into stuff. Like I have to log in to check my email, so I check it like twice a week, and I make myself do that. So that said, I find that something like Slack tends to work better because a lot of developers are already in Slack. So I've set up a JavaScript Jabber Slack, and I'm going to be inviting the panel to it today. But anyway, if you want to go ahead and jump in on that, I'll have a link for it in the show notes. You can also just go to javascriptjabber.com/Slack, and you can get on the sign up page there. Just sign up. I'm just doing $10 a month to get in, and basically what that does is it keeps the trolls out. It allows me to control, who's in there and what's going on a little bit better. But the other thing is that I'm hoping that I can get 50 or so people in there, and then use that money to actually pay for some industry expert, like maybe Uncle Bob or somebody, to come talk to us for an hour or so. And I find that it's easier with some of these folks to actually pay them to come. So that's what I'm kind of looking to do with that money, is kind of create a place where we can all keep up and talk about some of the things that we talked about on the show. So like I said, go check it out, javascriptjabber.com/Slack. The other thing that I'm going to pick, and this is related to that setup, is AWS Lambda. So Slack has an unpublished API you can use to invite people to your Slack team. And there's not really a great way to hit that, except for maybe as a direct post to the URL. And I just put a function into AWS Lambda and then told Zapier to call it. So when somebody signs up for that Slack channel, it goes through Zapier to AWS Lambda and then hits Slack and sends the invite out. So you get an invite pretty much right away. But it's pretty cool, and I've been pretty happy with that. The last pick I have is the framework that I used to get it all deployed, made it a whole lot easier. It's called Serverless, and it's pretty freaking awesome. And it's reasonably simple too. So there were a few things I had to do to get NPM modules exported so that they would go into Lambda, but it was like 2 steps in the config file, and that was it. So I was really, really happy with that. We'll probably get the maintainer of that project on the show. But yeah, those are things that I've been playing with that I've been really digging. Ryan, what are your picks?
Yeah, so my first pick is, something that maybe some of y'all have seen. I guess it came out a few months ago. It's called Prettier. And I think it's a